So, ladies and gentlemen, this is the recording I've promised you for Monday, the 23rd of December. So, there is not much left actually in the Java chapter. And what we will first look at in this session is exceptions. So this is the mechanism I told you about how we could handle certain things that could go wrong in a better way than just outputting something to the console or to the error stream. Second, we will talk a bit about code conventions, then a very brief mention of generics, and then last but not least, I will tell you a bit about the Java class library. Okay? And of course, there will be a bit of programming. At least we will go back to the statements and operators demo code that I gave you, which, as I saw, already contains some sort of exception handling, and we'll talk about this. Okay? Good. So, how is this thing done with exceptions? What are they good for? How do you work with them? So, first of all, when you remember when we programmed statements and operators, that was where we did these things such as programming the exponential function or the sine function or the expectation and these kind of things. So the purpose when we did this was mainly because I wanted to show you how to use loops and if statements and all these kind of things. Okay, so what we saw there was a couple of places where we would like the methods to do something more than just to show us, ooh, there is something wrong. For example, remember the factorial method that we programmed, right? So what would happen if I were to give that factorial method a negative number, right? And we will later analyze the code again, and what we will see there is we would produce an implicit error because the method would very likely return something as 0. And this is mathematically not true because the factorial of a negative number, if at all you can define it, for example, with the help of the gamma function, it would surely not be 0, right? And the same is true for the quadratic equation method that we wrote, right? What if the discriminant is, the value of the discriminant is smaller than 0? So that means we don't have any real solutions, right? We have only complex solutions to the quadratic equation. And last but not least, if the coefficients of the quadratic equation A or B or even C, if one of them is, if A is 0, then we don't have a quadratic equation at all, right? So in this case, it only has one or at most one real solution, right? And in this case, we should do more than just say, oh, I'm going to return a -1 or something, right? Because this is confusing for everyone that uses the code. So we got to have something better, right? And this is very general to handling errors that might occur during the program execution. One way to deal with these is to just terminate the Java virtual machine. But this is clearly a stupid solution because these kind of errors occur or might occur frequently, and we might want to react to these errors in an appropriate way. So the mechanism to do this in Java is so-called exceptions and exception handling. Right? What is an exception? As we read, an exception is an event which occurs during the execution of a program that disrupts the normal flow of the program's instructions. So here's a comma which should be deleted. I'm sorry, right? So an event that disrupts the normal flow of the program's instructions. So if we would insert a negative number to the factorial function, this is such an event because from there we cannot really continue our mathematical operations in a proper way because anything that we do from there would very likely be faulty, at least unless we would have mathematically much more elaborate factorial function that can make use of the gamma function, which we at this moment don't, right? What happens? So, as I told you, at least briefly, in this case, the method that kind of is related to this event, which disrupts the normal flow of programs instructions, is eligible to either handle it itself if it can. Well, the factorial method, if it's past a negative number, cannot really handle that in a graceful way, right? So the second line of action is to throw an exception like a ball to the method that called the potential fault or exception creating method, right? So if in a method or a constructor X, an error occurs during program execution, X may throw an exception to whoever called the method or constructor. Now, the one that called that thus knows, ooh, there's something that went wrong, so I better react to this myself, right? And this is a lot more, reasonable, because the method that asked the factorial method to compute the factorial of -5 may realize that it was in error itself and can then react, right? So if someone throws a ball at me being a method, then I know something went wrong and I could really take notice thereof, instead of the error going unnoticed and the calculation going totally faulty, right? So someone, either X itself or the method calling X, has to catch this ball, the exception, and has to take care of it, right? So the second case is the most typical one, actually, right? So taking care of means to treat the exception. If no one catches an exception, depending on the type of the exception, which we will talk about later, the program will terminate, right? So someone must take care if something goes wrong. And what we get is a whole cascade of such throwing events, right? So let's look at this diagram here. So we have a method 1 that calls a method 2, which in turn calls a method 3. Let's assume that in method 3, an error occurs, right? And let's assume that this error is of type exception XYZ, right? So exceptions can have different types depending on what went wrong. Let's assume method 3 cannot handle that, right? So in this case, method 3 might be something like our factorial method. And if method 2 calls method 3 with a negative number inside, what could the factorial function do? Nothing. So it cannot handle the faulty case. So it throws an exception to method 2. Let's assume method 2 can also not handle this exception XYZ, so it throws again the exception or forwards it to method 1, which we assume in this case to be able to handle the exception of type XYZ, right? So method 1 will catch the exception, handle it, and then maybe later on call again method 2 with a corrected version, and method 2 might then again call method 3 with a corrected set of parameters. Okay, so this is the basic type